There are a lot of awful ways to make money in this world, but I think the worst of all of them is the literal sale of human beings. Infants, no less. But with the support of the voters of the great state of Arizona, this man, Paul Peterson, was doing exactly that. Let's get into it. Between the years of 1980 and 2005, international adoptions in the United States quadrupled. It went from around 5,000 to 21,000, give or take. But at that same time, oddly enough, private adoptions within the United States halved. And although there's no clear consensus for exactly why that happened, experts do point to a number of likely causes. The first is that teenage pregnancies were on the decline, and on top of that, unwed mothers were no longer facing as strong of a social stigma as in previous generations. Not to mention that they were being accepted more readily into the workplace with wages that allowed them to support that child. So put another way, even though the birth rate didn't really change and abortions were steadily on the decline, for those looking to start a family through adoption, it was becoming much harder to find American women who were willing to give up their children as infants. What's more, adoption itself began to change. Today, 95% of adoptions of infants in the United States are done so within a system known as open, which means that the original birth parents still legally have access to, at the very least, some form of relationship with that child. And that means out of 18,000 children who are given up for adoption at infancy every year in the US, only around 900 or so are done within a closed system, which naturally has pushed a great many people abroad. Because little of this applies when adopting internationally. For prospective parents reaching outside of America's borders, not only are there still a much larger number of infants available to adopt, but the expectation is that their relationship with those birth parents will not have to be maintained. Adopting an infant from abroad, generally speaking, comes with the belief that the child will be completely severed from whatever woman they came out of. In effect, it will be theirs completely. Which, as you might imagine, is quite the draw. And I'm not shaming them for that. If I were going to adopt, that's probably the way that I would want to do it as well. It's just, it has led to complications, serious complications, especially when you consider that a lot of those mothers abroad don't actually understand what they're getting into. And I think the best way to describe that is through the story of Paul Peterson, the baby salesman of Maricopa County. Paul is a Mormon, a religion that has its male followers spend 2 years trying to find people to join that church. A way of making money through foreigners under the guise of salvation. Foreigners who, if they agree, will have to pony up 10% of their salary for the rest of their lives. They call this their mission. Paul's mission was to the Marshall Islands, one of the planet's most remote and poorest nations. It's a truly lovely place with absolutely lovely people, but it's also one without a lot of economic opportunity. It's a nation where US aid, meant mainly as a means of propping up their military bases, accounts for around 60% of the national budget or so. And in the Marshalls, Paul would find more than just new tithes for those coffers back in Utah. He would find babies. Babies who he could sell back to America. Although he certainly wasn't the first one to figure that out. Between 1996 and 1999, as Paul's plans were just beginning, it's said that over 500 Marshallese infants were adopted by American parents, which at the outset might seem kind of small, a drop in the ocean of 330 million Americans. But to the fewer than 40,000 Marshallese citizens of that time, it accounted for around 10% of all births. In 1999, for example, roughly 1,400 children were born and over 150 of them were adopted. That means that despite being the 7th least populated country on Earth, it was enough to put them in the top 20 national suppliers of children to the United States. Okay, so you might be thinking, what's the problem though? If they didn't want the babies and somebody else did, then that kind of sounds like a win-win, right? Plus, they were being paid. Over a year's salary, no less. But as it turns out, when those Marshallese women were polled, over 85% of them said that they didn't understand that the system of adoption they were undertaking was different from that of the Marshalls. Over 70% of them didn't understand that if that adoption wasn't working out, they couldn't take their baby back. They believed and were told that this was going to be an open system. But in practice, it was anything but. This tends to be pitched as effectively a cultural issue. In the Marshall Islands, children tend to be raised communally. Many parents have to go work abroad, and so, adopted or not, they still expect to maintain a relationship with that child. Birth parents have that right. Theirs is a perpetually open system by design, and it has historically always been this way. The very concept of what people like Paul were doing didn't really exist in their world. And so for the most part, they only realized what had happened to them once it was too late. With money in their hands and a feeling of deep personal shame, it wasn't like they were going to go to their neighbors and talk about what they'd done. And what's more, it's not like they always had the best of intentions themselves. These are humans, not saints. Many mothers saw this as a means of escape, leaving a bad situation in the Marshalls to set themselves up on the mainland. It was a free flight with enough cash to start again somewhere new. And others were simply children themselves. A 15-year-old who was selling her third child, or for that matter, was herself a prostitute to the incoming fishing ships. They would have very little agency over their own bodies, or for that matter, that which came out of their bodies. For the most part, these were people without much in the way of social power who the system simply wasn't built to protect. They were the poorest of the world's poor. And so that system of abuse continued for years. Children were sold in the hundreds, and men like Paul profited deeply. But for a country as small as the Marshalls, it isn't like this went unnoticed, poor or not. Adoptions were bleeding the country of its future. And so in 2002, they changed the laws. Without formal government permission, Americans can no longer adopt Marshallese children, and at least on paper, Marshallese women could no longer go to the US simply as a means of putting a child up for adoption. But here's the problem with that. The Marshalls aren't like other countries. Their relationship with the United States means that people don't need a visa to enter, heavily pregnant or not. And if their children are born on US soil, they're legally American citizens. Americans who can be given up for adoption. But it isn't like Paul was just some Latter-day Saint. He was an adoption lawyer and an elected official, a Maricopa County tax assessor, a Republican, no less. Which I only mention because of the way that party currently positions itself in its propaganda as the protectors of children. As an adoption lawyer working alongside an organization called Children's House International, he'd have direct access to rich Americans looking for infants who'd view him as a moral authority. And because he was active in the Mormon community, even though the church didn't necessarily support him in any way, being an elder meant that there he was also considered a figure of authority. And so a lot of the children would go directly to fellow church members, parents who he would eventually bilk for what prosecutors could show to be nearly $3 million, although it was likely much more. He would then wire transfer a bit of that money to this woman, a Marshallese citizen, who would then house those incoming mothers in her Arkansas home and lie to them about their rights. When one of the prospective parents came to visit the mother of their soon-to-be child, they testified later as having seen over a dozen mothers sleeping in a single room, many of them not even being given a bed. As an elected official, he would falsify documents that claimed that those mothers were U.S. residents, and then he'd turn around and use those same documents to defraud the Medicare system. In Arizona alone, he's said to have stolen over $800,000 from the medical system. Yet those mothers claimed that they received none of it, virtually zero prenatal care. They would go on to claim and testify that they felt as though they were being treated more like products, like human chattel. So despite the first investigations taking place in 1998, it would only be in 2020, when a social worker noticed irregularities in birth mother residency permits, that Paul would finally be arrested and charged. Since 2015 alone, he was shown to have trafficked at least 70 different women, but it's probably much more. As of today, Paul Peterson is behind bars, and rightly so. The maximum sentence for his crimes was 315 years, but he's likely only going to spend somewhere between 11 to 15, just a few weeks per child. But it should be noted that he's not alone in doing this. He's just the first one they caught. Children from the Marshall Islands are still being bought by American families today. Families who, for the most part, probably don't even realize what they're doing. Adoption can be a beautiful thing. Every child deserves to grow up in a family who loves them. If you're thinking of adopting, I cannot encourage you enough. But if you're thinking of adopting from abroad, especially as a means in your mind of helping someone out, please do your research, because men like Paul exist. And just because some mother is foreign, just because she's poorer than you, it doesn't make you some modern day saint to buy her baby. This is Rare Earth.